24 hours to appear in probate court, or forfeit any claim to my father's estate forever. I hadn't spoken to Margaret Chen in 3 years, not since Dad's funeral when she'd made it crystal clear I wasn't welcome at my own family home. But this wasn't just about money. This was about erasing me completely. I stood there in my cramped studio apartment in downtown Phoenix, water dripping from my jacket onto the scuffed hardwood floor, holding that legal document like it might spontaneously combust. The letterhead was from Whitmore Associates, the kind of law firm that charged by the minute just to breathe their recycled air. Margaret wasn't playing games anymore. My name was Emma Rodriguez, and at 25, I was about to lose everything my father had worked 40 years to build. Everything he'd promised would be mine. The apartment felt like it was shrinking around me as I paced between the kitchenette and my makeshift desk, where my laptop sat buried under a mountain of textbooks from my paralegal program at Phoenix Community College. 3 years of scraping by on part-time work at a legal aid clinic, surviving on ramen noodles and student loans, all because Margaret had convinced Dad to cut off my college fund after what she delicately called my rebellious phase. What she really meant was the phase where I'd started asking uncomfortable questions about the family business. Rodriguez Import/Export had been my father's life's work, his American dream made manifest in steel and concrete. Born in Guadalajara, Miguel Rodriguez had arrived in Phoenix in 1985, with nothing but a high school education and an unshakable belief that hard work could overcome anything. 40 years later, he'd built a network that brought specialty goods from across Latin America to high-end restaurants throughout Arizona, New Mexico, and Southern California. When I was little, maybe 6 or 7, Dad would take me to the warehouse on Saturday mornings. The place smelled like coffee beans and dried chilies, cardamom and vanilla, a symphony of scents that told stories of distant places and family traditions. He'd lift me up to reach the high shelves, let me help organize invoices in his cluttered office, and tell me stories about the artisan families whose products we imported. This tortilla press, he'd say, running his weathered hands over the smooth wood, comes from a family in Oaxaca, 5 generations making the same design. And these vanilla beans? The Morales family has been growing them in Veracruz since before your great-grandmother was born. He'd pause then, looking at me with those serious dark eyes that meant he was about to say something important. Someday, Mija, this will all be yours. You'll carry on what we built together. You'll be the bridge between these families and the people who appreciate what they make. I'd believed him then. I'd spent my teenage years learning Spanish from our suppliers, studying business at Phoenix Central High, even taking weekend trips to Mexico to meet the artisan families Dad worked with. I was going to be the next generation of Rodriguez Import/Export, the daughter who would expand the business into new markets and maybe even get us into some of those fancy grocery chains Dad always talked about. But that was before Margaret Chen entered our lives like a perfectly manicured tornado. I first met her at Café Luna, a trendy spot in Old Town Scottsdale, where Dad had started taking his business meetings after someone told him it made him look more sophisticated. Margaret was there representing Chen and Associates, a consulting firm that specialized in, quote, operational efficiency for family businesses. She wore a cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than I made in a month at my summer job, and her black hair was pulled back in a bun so perfect it looked architectural. Dad was immediately smitten. At 58, he'd been alone for 7 years since Mom died of cancer, and Margaret represented everything he thought he should want in a partner. She was educated, successful, and spoke fluent Spanish, despite being third-generation Chinese American. More importantly, she seemed genuinely interested in his business, asking detailed questions about supply chains and profit margins that I, even as his daughter, had never thought to ask. The courtship was swift and surgical. Within 6 months, Margaret was attending family barbecues and inserting herself into business discussions. Within a year, she'd moved into our house in Paradise Valley, the sprawling adobe ranch that Dad had bought for Mom before I was born. And within 18 months, they were married in a small ceremony at the Little White Chapel in Las Vegas. I was away at Arizona State University, majoring in international business with a minor in Latin American studies, when I got the call. Dad's voice was excited, almost giddy, as he told me about the wonderful woman he'd married. Margaret got on the phone afterward, her voice warm and welcoming as she talked about how excited she was to have a daughter. "Your father talks about you constantly," she said. He's so proud of the woman you're becoming. We both are. I should have known then that something was wrong. Margaret was many things, but she was never effusive. Every word she spoke was calculated, measured, designed to achieve a specific outcome. The changes started small. Dad began using new accounting software that Margaret had recommended. Old suppliers started complaining that their payments were delayed, processed through a more efficient system that somehow took weeks longer than the handwritten checks Dad had always used. Family friends who'd worked with the business for decades found themselves gradually frozen out, replaced by Margaret's professional contacts who could provide better rates and more reliable service. I didn't notice the pattern at first. I was busy with school, working toward my degree and planning my triumphant return to the family business. But during my junior year, when I came home for Thanksgiving, something felt different. The warehouse was exactly the same. Same smells, same organized chaos of boxes and pallets. But Dad's office had been transformed. The cluttered desk where he'd taught me to read invoices was now a monument to organizational efficiency, with color-coded filing systems and a computer setup that looked like it belonged in a tech startup. The walls, once covered with photos of our supplier families and handwritten thank you notes from restaurant owners, now displayed framed certificates from business associations I'd never heard of. Margaret helped me modernize, Dad explained when I asked about the changes. We're more professional now, more competitive. But the warmth was gone. The stories about artisan families had been replaced by discussions of market penetration and cost optimization. The Saturday morning trips to the warehouse stopped entirely. It was during Christmas break of my senior year that I finally worked up the courage to ask the questions that had been nagging at me for months. Dad, what happened to the Morales family contract? Their vanilla was our signature product. He paused in the middle of reviewing what looked like a spreadsheet analysis of supplier performance metrics. Margaret found a more cost-effective source. Same quality, better pricing structure. But the Morales family has been with us for 15 years. Don't we owe them some loyalty? That's when Margaret appeared in the doorway of the office, her smile perfectly calibrated to convey patient understanding tinged with gentle concern. Emma, sweetheart, I know this is hard to understand, but business isn't about emotion. It's about sustainability. If we want Rodriguez import/export to survive in a competitive market, we have to make difficult decisions based on data, not sentiment. She sat down across from me, her posture radiating the kind of authority that came from MBA programs and corporate consulting. Your father has built something beautiful here, but beautiful doesn't always mean profitable. We're not abandoning anyone. We're evolving. The families we work with now are more reliable, more scalable. They can grow with us as we expand. Expand into what? Margaret exchanged a look with Dad that I couldn't quite read. We're exploring some exciting new opportunities. Larger contracts, different types of products. Your father has been thinking too small for too long. That's when I made my first mistake. I pushed back. Thinking too small? Dad built this business from nothing. He created relationships that spanned decades. That's not small. That's meaningful. The temperature in the room dropped about 10 degrees. Emma, Dad said quietly, Margaret knows what she's talking about. She has an MBA from Wharton. She's helped dozens of family businesses optimize their operations. But this isn't just any family business. This is our family business, our history, our connections. Margaret's smile never wavered, but something shifted behind her eyes. Of course, dear, and that history will always be important. But we can't let sentimentality hold us back from building something even better. Something that will provide security for all of us. The conversation ended there, but something fundamental had changed. I'd crossed a line I didn't even know existed. Over the next few months, as I finished my senior year, the phone calls from Dad became less frequent. When we did talk, Margaret was often in the background, interjecting helpful clarifications or gently steering the conversation towards safer topics. My suggestions for post-graduation involvement in the business were met with vague promises to discuss it later and reminders that I should focus on my studies. Then came the letter. It arrived 2 weeks before graduation, delivered to my dorm room in a manila envelope with the Rodriguez import/export logo in the corner. Inside was a single sheet of letterhead, typed and formal. explaining that the family scholarship fund that had been paying for my education was being restructured to better align with the company's new strategic direction. In other words, I was on my own. Dad called that night, his voice strained and apologetic. Maya, I'm sorry. Margaret showed me the numbers, and we just can't justify the expense right now. The business is going through some changes, and we need to be more careful with our cash flow. What changes, Dad? The business has been profitable for 40 years. It's complicated. You'll understand when you're older. I'm 21 years old, and I'm about to graduate with a degree in international business. I think I can understand basic financial concepts. There was a long pause. Maybe it's better this way, he said finally. Maybe you should explore other opportunities. Build your own path instead of just following in my footsteps. I wanted to scream. I wanted to demand an explanation. I wanted to ask him when he'd stopped believing that I was capable of carrying on the family legacy. Mevi. Instead, I said, okay, Dad, I understand, but I didn't understand. Not then. Graduation came and went without my family in attendance. Dad had a scheduling conflict, some important supplier meeting that Margaret had arranged. I walked across that stage alone, my diploma feeling like a participation trophy instead of the achievement I'd worked 4 years to earn. I moved back to Phoenix afterward, not because I wanted to be close to family, but because it was the only place I could afford. The job market was brutal for new graduates without connections, and Margaret had made it clear that Rodriguez Import/Export wasn't hiring. It wouldn't be appropriate, she explained during one of our increasingly rare family dinners. People might think you're getting special treatment because of your relationship to Miguel. It's better for everyone if you establish yourself independently first. So I established myself independently. I rented a studio apartment in a converted warehouse downtown, far from the sprawling suburbs where I'd grown up. I took a part-time job at a legal aid clinic, filing papers and answering phones for lawyers who fought for people who couldn't afford Whitmore Associates. And I enrolled in the paralegal program at Phoenix Community College, figuring that if I couldn't join the family business, at least I could learn enough about law to understand why I'd been so effectively excluded from it. The transformation was gradual but relentless. Family dinners became monthly obligations instead of weekly traditions. Dad's calls became brief check-ins focused on my grades and job prospects, with no mention of the business that had once been our shared passion. And Margaret's presence became a constant barrier between my father and me, a perfectly polite wall that somehow made real conversation impossible. The final blow came during what would be our last Christmas together as a family. I'd brought a carefully researched business proposal, a plan for expanding Rodriguez Import/Export into artisanal coffee, complete with supplier contacts I'd developed through my classes and market analysis I'd done on my own time. I thought maybe, just maybe, if I could prove that I understood both the old values and the new realities, I could find my way back into the business. Margaret listened to my presentation with the kind of patient attention she might give to a child explaining why vegetables tasted better with ketchup. That's very impressive, Emma, she said when I finished. You've clearly put a lot of thought into this, but I'm afraid you're missing some key considerations. She proceeded to dismantle my proposal with surgical precision, pointing out market risks I hadn't considered, regulatory complications I hadn't researched, and financial projections that she claimed were overly optimistic. Every criticism was delivered with a smile, every objection wrapped in praise for my enthusiasm and creativity. Dad sat silently through the entire exchange, occasionally nodding at Margaret's points but never offering any opinions of his own. The coffee market is extremely saturated, Margaret concluded, and artisanal products require a level of expertise and relationship management that, frankly, we don't have the bandwidth to develop right now. We're focused on optimizing our existing operations before we consider expansion. But Dad built this business on exactly those kinds of relationships, I protested. He knows artisan families all over Mexico and Central America. This would be a natural extension of what we already do. That's when Margaret's mask slipped, just for a moment. Emma, sweetheart, I think you're romanticizing the past. Your father's success has come from adapting to market realities, not from clinging to outdated business models. The artisan approach might have worked 30 years ago, but today's consumers want reliability, consistency, and competitive pricing. Sentiment doesn't pay the bills. I looked at Dad, waiting for him to defend the values he'd spent my entire childhood teaching me, waiting for him to explain that the relationships he'd built weren't just business transactions, but connections between cultures and communities. Instead, he cleared his throat and said, "Margaret's right, Mija. We have to think about the bottom line." That's when I realized I'd lost him. Not just his support for my business ideas, but him. The father who'd taught me to value tradition and relationships had been replaced by someone who spoke in corporate buzzwords and deferred to his wife's expertise. I left that night and didn't come back. For 3 years, I built a life that had nothing to do with Rodriguez Import/Export, or Margaret Chen, or the family legacy I'd once thought was my birthright. I focused on my paralegal studies, threw myself into my work at the legal aid clinic, and tried to convince myself that I was better off without the complications of family business. But I wasn't better off. I was surviving, not thriving. And every day I wondered what had really happened to the business I'd grown up loving, the father I'd once been so close to, and the future I'd planned since childhood. Dad died on a Tuesday in March, sudden and unexpected from a massive heart attack at age 62. Margaret called to tell me, her voice carefully modulated to convey appropriate grief without overwhelming emotion. "He went peacefully," she said. "At the office, doing what he loved." The funeral was a stark, elegant affair at a non-denominational chapel in Scottsdale. Margaret had chosen everything: the flowers, the music, even the readings. Dad's supplier friends and longtime business contacts were notably absent, replaced by Margaret's professional network and a handful of distant relatives I barely recognized. I sat in the back row wearing a black dress I'd bought at Goodwill and listened to Margaret deliver a eulogy about my father's entrepreneurial spirit and commitment to excellence. She spoke about his vision for modernizing family business practices and his dedication to building something sustainable for future generations. She never mentioned the artisan families he'd worked with for decades. She never talked about the stories he used to tell about tradition and connection. She never acknowledged that the future generation he'd been building for was sitting right there in the back row, uninvited and unwelcome. After the service, Margaret approached me with that same perfectly calibrated smile. "Emma, I know this is difficult. Your father loved you very much, and he was proud of the woman you've become." "Thank you," I managed. "Of course there will be some paperwork to handle regarding the estate. Nothing complicated, but I'll have my lawyers reach out to you in a few weeks." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "I hope you know that despite our differences, I've always wanted what's best for this family. Your father did too. That was 3 years ago." I never heard from Margaret's lawyers. I never received any paperwork about the estate. I assumed that Dad had left everything to his wife, as most people do, and that my inheritance was limited to memories and the box of childhood photos Margaret had grudgingly allowed me to take from the house. I was wrong about a lot of things. Now, standing in my apartment with that court summons in my hands, I realized that Margaret hadn't been content to simply exclude me from the family business. She'd been planning to erase me from the family entirely. According to the legal documents, she was petitioning the court to finalize the estate distribution based on Dad's clearly expressed final wishes and my voluntary abandonment of all claims. The paperwork painted a picture of an ungrateful daughter who had rejected her father's attempts to include her in the business, chosen to pursue her own path, and then abandoned the family entirely after his death. It was a masterful piece of fiction, supported by carefully curated evidence. Emails I'd never seen, witnesses I'd never met, and documentation of business meetings I'd supposedly refused to attend. But Margaret had made one crucial mistake. She'd assumed that Dad had been as thoroughly convinced by her narrative as everyone else. I walked to my bedroom closet and pulled out the small fireproof lockbox I'd inherited from my grandmother, Abuela Rosa. Inside, beneath old immigration papers and birth certificates, was a manila envelope I hadn't opened in 3 years. Dad had given it to me on my 21st birthday, along with a bottle of expensive tequila and a speech about becoming a woman. "Just in case something happens to me, Mija," he'd said, pressing the envelope into my hands with unusual seriousness. "Sometimes families aren't what they seem. Sometimes the people we trust most are the ones we should trust least." I'd laughed at the time, thinking he was being overly dramatic. Dad had always had a flair for the theatrical, especially after a few drinks. "What's in it?" I'd asked. Insurance, he'd said. The kind you hope you never need to use. I'd forgotten about the envelope in the chaos after his death, too overwhelmed by grief and rejection to remember his cryptic warnings. But now, holding that court summons in one hand and the sealed envelope in the other, I realized my father had been trying to protect me all along, even from beyond the grave. Loan. The envelope was heavier than I remembered, thick with documents and what felt like a small electronic device. As I tore open the seal with trembling hands, I wondered what Margaret would think if she knew what was coming. Inside was a handwritten letter in Dad's familiar scrawl, along with a stack of photocopied documents, several USB drives, and what looked like a small digital recording device. The letter was dated just 6 months before his death. My dearest Emma, if you're reading this, then something has happened to me, and Margaret is probably trying to steal everything we built together. I'm sorry, Mija. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you while I was alive, and I'm sorry it took me so long to see what she really was. I was a fool. A lonely, proud fool who let a beautiful woman convince me that business was more important than family, that efficiency was more valuable than relationship, that profit mattered more than tradition. But I wasn't completely blind. When I realized what she was doing, what she had been doing from the very beginning, I started keeping records. Everything is in this envelope. Bank records, supplier contracts, correspondence with government agencies, recordings of conversations she thought were private. Margaret isn't just stealing our business, Emma. She's been using Rodriguez import/export to launder money for some very dangerous people. The efficiency improvements she implemented, they're designed to hide transactions that have nothing to do with legitimate importing. The new suppliers she found? They're fronts for operations that would make your blood run cold. I have proof of everything, but I'm too much of a coward to use it while I'm alive. I'm too afraid of what it would mean for my reputation, my business, my life with her. But you're stronger than I am, Mija. You always have been. The documents in this envelope will prove that Margaret has been stealing from legitimate suppliers, falsifying import documents, and using our warehouse to store products that never appear on any manifest. The recordings will prove that she's been planning to eliminate me as soon as she gains full control of the business. I've also included evidence that she forged my signature on a new will, one that leaves everything to her and makes it look like I deliberately excluded you from the inheritance. The real will, the one I filed with my attorney before I married her, leaves everything to you. Margaret doesn't know about it because I used a different lawyer, someone she never met. I know you probably hate me right now. I know I've been a terrible father these past few years. But please, Mija, don't let her win. Don't let her destroy everything we built together. Don't let her get away with erasing you from our family story. Use this information wisely. Trust the right people. And remember that no matter how far apart we grew, you were always the future I was building toward. Trust right te amo siempre. Trust right te at papa. PS call agent Sarah Chen at the FBI Phoenix office. Not a relative, just an unfortunate coincidence of names. She's been investigating Margaret for months. Tell her you have Miguel Rodriguez's insurance policy. I sank onto my bed, the letter shaking in my hands. Everything made sense now. The gradual exclusion, the business changes, the carefully orchestrated estrangement. Margaret hadn't just been stealing my inheritance. She'd been using my father's life's work to commit federal crimes. And tomorrow, I was supposed to walk into that courtroom and let her get away with it. I looked at the clock on my nightstand, 9:47 p.m. In less than 24 hours, I would be standing in front of a judge, listening to Margaret's lawyers explain why I had no claim to my father's estate. But they had no idea what I was bringing to that courtroom. I picked up my phone and scrolled through the contacts until I found the number for the FBI's Phoenix office. Agent Sarah Chen might not be expecting a call this late, but something told me she'd want to hear what I had to say. As I waited for someone to answer, I looked around my cramped studio apartment one last time. Tomorrow, everything would change. Either I'd be vindicated and wealthy, or I'd be facing charges as an accessory to whatever crimes Margaret had committed using my family's business. But for the first time in 3 years, I felt like myself again. Like the daughter Miguel Rodriguez had raised to value truth over comfort, justice over peace. Margaret wanted everything. She was about to get more than she bargained for. The FBI Phoenix office was a fortress of glass and steel that reflected the desert sunrise like a warning. I'd been awake all night poring over Dad's documents until my eyes burned and my coffee had gone cold for the third time. Now, sitting in the parking lot at 6:30 a.m., I wondered if I was about to make the biggest mistake of my life. Agent Sarah Chen's voice had been crisp and professional when I'd called the night before, but I'd detected something else underneath. Interest, maybe even excitement. When I'd mentioned Miguel Rodriguez's insurance policy, the line had gone quiet for a long moment. "Ms. Rodriguez," she'd said finally, "I think we need to meet in person. Can you be here first thing in the morning?" Now, clutching Dad's envelope like a lifeline, I walked through the lobby and submitted to the security screening that seemed designed to remind visitors that they were entering a place where secrets had consequences. Agent Chen met me at the elevator, a woman in her early 40s with shoulder-length black hair and the kind of alert eyes that missed nothing. She wore a navy blazer over dark jeans, and her handshake was firm enough to suggest she could probably break my wrist if the situation called for it. "Emma Rodriguez?" she asked, though her expression suggested she already knew the answer. "Thank you for coming in so early. I know this must be difficult." She led me through a maze of cubicles and conference rooms to a small office with her name on the door. The walls were covered with organizational charts, maps, and what looked like surveillance photos. I recognized some of the locations, warehouses, and office buildings in the industrial district where Rodriguez Import/Export was located. "Coffee?" she offered, gesturing to a chair across from her desk. "Please," I said, realizing that my hands were shaking slightly. She poured 2 cups from a machine that looked like it belonged in a NASA control room, then sat down and studied me with the kind of professional assessment that made me feel simultaneously important and terrified. "Before we start," she said, "I need to ask you something. How much do you know about your stepmother's activities over the past 5 years? I thought about Dad's letter, about the gradual changes to the business, about all the warning signs I'd missed or ignored. Until last night, I thought she was just a controlling woman who wanted me out of the family business. Now I'm starting to think she's something much worse." Agent Chen nodded. "We've been investigating Margaret Chen for 18 months. She's connected to a network of businesses throughout the Southwest that we believe are involved in money laundering, document fraud, and human trafficking. Your father's company was flagged as a potential front operation about a year ago." The coffee suddenly tasted like ash. "Human trafficking?" "Among other things. The import/export business is perfect for moving both money and people across borders. Legitimate cargo provides cover for illegal shipments, and the financial complexity makes it easy to hide transactions." I set down my cup with a hand that was no longer just shaking but trembling visibly. My father would never have been involved in something like that. He built that business to help artisan families, to preserve traditional crafts and recipes. He was a good man. "I believe you," Agent Chen said gently. "And I think that's exactly why Margaret chose him. She needed a legitimate business with an established reputation and clean records. More importantly, she needed someone who would trust her completely and not ask too many questions about operational changes." She pulled out a thick file folder and spread several photographs across her desk. I recognized Margaret in most of them, but she was meeting with people I'd never seen. Men in expensive suits. Women with the kind of polished appearance that screamed money and power. "We've been watching her network for months, but we've never been able to get inside. Your stepmother is extremely careful about electronic communications, and she's surrounded herself with people who know how to stay quiet. Until now, we haven't had anyone on the inside willing to talk." I thought about Dad's letter, about the recordings and documents he'd mentioned. What if I told you that my father documented everything? That he kept records of conversations, financial transactions, supplier changes, everything Margaret did to the business after they got married? Agent Chen leaned forward, her professional composure cracking slightly. "I'd say that your father might have just handed us the break we've been looking for." I reached into the envelope and pulled out one of the USB drives Dad had left me. "There are 3 of these, plus bank records, shipping manifests, and recorded conversations. He started documenting things about 6 months before he died." Agent Chen took the drive like it was made of gold. "Before we look at this, I need to explain something about the legal situation. If your father's evidence proves what we think it might prove, Margaret isn't just going to lose a civil case. She's going to face federal charges that could put her in prison for decades. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny and potential danger? The question hit me like a physical blow. I'd been so focused on the estate dispute, on proving that I deserved my inheritance, that I hadn't fully processed the implications of what Dad had discovered. You're saying she might try to hurt me? I'm saying that people involved in the kind of operation we're investigating don't typically respond well to exposure. If Margaret realizes what you have, she might see you as a threat that needs to be eliminated. I thought about the cramped studio apartment I'd been living in for 3 years, the dead-end job that barely paid my bills, the future that had been stolen from me piece by piece. Then I thought about my father, alone and afraid, but still brave enough to document the truth. She already eliminated me once, I said. She just didn't finish the job. Agent Chen smiled for the first time since I'd met her. In that case, let's see what your father left us. She plugged the USB drive into her computer, and we waited while the files loaded. The screen filled with folders organized by date, each one containing documents, audio files, and what appeared to be financial records. Jesus, Agent Chen murmured, scrolling through the directory. This is comprehensive. She clicked on an audio file dated about 4 months before Dad's death. His voice filled the room, tired but determined. March 15th, recording number 12. Margaret is on the phone in the office, speaking in Mandarin to someone she calls Uncle. I've been studying Mandarin with an online program, and I think I understand more than she realizes. She's discussing a shipment that's supposed to arrive next week, something about special cargo that needs to be moved quickly and quietly. The manifest she showed me lists kitchen equipment from Guangzhou, but the conversation suggests it's something else entirely. The recording continued with Dad's careful translation of what he'd overheard. Margaret had been arranging for a container to bypass normal customs inspection, using Rodriguez's import/export's established reputation to avoid scrutiny. The kitchen equipment was actually machinery for an illegal manufacturing operation. Agent Chen paused the recording. Your father was remarkably thorough. This level of detail, combined with the financial records, could be enough to bring down the entire network. She opened another file, a spreadsheet that tracked discrepancies between the manifests Margaret had shown Dad and the actual contents of shipments. Over the course of 2 years, hundreds of thousands of dollars in unexplained goods had moved through the Rodriguez warehouse. Look at this, she said, pointing to a series of entries from the previous fall. These shipments were supposedly vanilla extract and coffee beans from Guatemala, but the weights don't match. A container of vanilla extract shouldn't weigh 12,000 pounds. I studied the numbers, remembering my father's meticulous attention to detail. He'd built his business on knowing exactly what was coming and going, on maintaining relationships with suppliers who trusted him to handle their products with care. What do you think was really in those containers? Based on similar cases we've investigated, probably people. Human trafficking operations often use food shipments as cover because they're less likely to be thoroughly inspected. The reality of what Margaret had done, what she had used my father's life's work to accomplish, hit me like a physical blow. Dad had spent 40 years building relationships with artisan families, creating a business that honored tradition and helped people preserve their cultural heritage. Margaret had turned it into a pipeline for some of the worst crimes imaginable. Agent Chen opened another audio file, this one from just 3 weeks before Dad's death. His voice was shakier this time, frightened. April 2nd, recording number 28. I confronted Margaret about the Guatemalan shipments today. I told her I knew the weights were wrong, that something wasn't adding up. She didn't deny it. She just looked at me with this cold expression and said that I had 2 choices. I could continue to be a useful partner, or I could become a liability. When I asked what that meant, she said that liabilities had a way of disappearing. My blood went cold. She threatened him. It gets worse, Agent Chen said, advancing to another file. Listen to this one. Dad's voice again, barely above a whisper. April 8th. Final recording. Margaret doesn't know I'm documenting this, but I think she's planning to kill me. She's been asking strange questions about my will, about what would happen to the business if something happened to me. She's also been encouraging me to change my life insurance beneficiary, suggesting that it would be, quote, cleaner if everything went directly to her instead of being divided between her and Emma. The recording paused, and I could hear Dad's labored breathing. I've been having chest pains for weeks, but Margaret keeps insisting that I don't need to see a doctor. She says it's just stress from the business, that it will pass once we finalize some pending deals. But I'm not stupid. I know what digitalis looks like, and I know what it does to a heart that's already under stress. She's been putting it in my coffee. Agent Chen stopped the recording. The silence in the office was deafening. Digitalis? I asked, though I was afraid to hear the answer. A heart medication that's perfectly legal and easy to obtain. In small doses, it regulates heart rhythm. In larger doses, especially for someone who doesn't need it, it can cause cardiac arrest. And it's almost impossible to detect in a routine autopsy unless you're specifically looking for it. I felt like the room was spinning. Dad hadn't died of natural causes. Margaret had murdered him. Did you order a full toxicology report after his death? Agent Chen shook her head. We weren't investigating your father at the time of his death. We were focused on the business operations, not on him personally. By the time we realized he might be a victim rather than a perpetrator, it was too late to request additional testing. She opened another folder on the USB drive, this one containing financial records that made my head spin. Bank transfers, offshore accounts, cash transactions that had been carefully structured to avoid federal reporting requirements. Margaret hadn't just been using Rodriguez import/export as a front. She'd been using it to wash money for a massive criminal organization. These records show more than $3 million moving through your father's business accounts over the past 2 years, Agent Chen said. Money that came in as payments for legitimate imports but was immediately transferred to accounts in the Cayman Islands, Hong Kong, and Switzerland. I stared at the numbers, trying to process the scope of what I was seeing. My father's small, family-owned business had been turned into a laundromat for international criminals. What happens now? I asked. Agent Chen looked at her watch. Well, first, we need to make sure you're safe. If Margaret realizes what you have, you could be in immediate danger. Second, we need to prepare for your court appearance this afternoon. And third, we need to coordinate with federal prosecutors to make sure we handle this correctly. Court appearance? I thought I was just turning over evidence. Emma, think about it. Margaret is petitioning the court to finalize an estate distribution based on a forged will. She's expecting to walk out of that courtroom today with legal control of a business she's been using to commit federal crimes. If we arrest her beforehand, her lawyers will claim prosecutorial misconduct, and the evidence might be thrown out on technicalities. I began to understand. But if she lies to a federal judge about the will, about my father's intentions, about her right to inherit the business, then she's committing perjury and fraud in front of multiple witnesses, in a proceeding that's being recorded and transcribed. It's the kind of evidence that's almost impossible to challenge later. Agent Chen stood up and walked to her window, which looked out over the Phoenix skyline. In the distance, I could see the mountains that surrounded the valley, stark and unforgiving under the morning sun. I'm going to be honest with you, Emma. What we're asking you to do is dangerous. You'll be walking into that courtroom knowing that Margaret is a murderer, knowing that she's surrounded by people who are willing to kill to protect their operation. If something goes wrong, if she realizes what you're planning... She killed my father, I said quietly. She stole my inheritance, destroyed my family, and turned my father's life's work into something evil. I'm not walking away now. Agent Chen nodded. In that case, we need to prepare you for what's going to happen in that courtroom. Margaret's lawyers are going to paint you as a bitter, ungrateful daughter who abandoned her family. They're going to have witnesses who'll testify that your father deliberately excluded you from his will because of your behavior. What witnesses? I barely spoke to anyone in the family after Margaret and Dad got married. Hired witnesses. People who were paid to memorize a story about interactions they never actually had with your father. Margaret has been planning this for years, Emma. She's thought of everything. Agent Chen returned to her desk and pulled out a legal pad. But she didn't think of your father's insurance policy. She doesn't know about the recordings, the financial documents, or the evidence that proves she forged his will. She's walking into that courtroom confident that she's already won. I thought about Margaret's perfect smile, her calculated warmth, the way she'd systematically eliminated me from my father's life while appearing to be the loving stepmother who just wanted what was best for everyone. What do you need me to do? First, we're going to wire you for sound. Everything that happens in that courtroom needs to be recorded, including any conversations you might have with Margaret or her lawyers before the hearing begins. Second, you're going to let her and her legal team make their case completely. Don't interrupt, don't object, don't give them any indication that you know more than they think you know. Agent Chen leaned forward, her expression serious. Then, when the judge asks if you have anything to say in your own defense, you're going to hand him the real will, the one your father filed before he married Margaret. The one that leaves everything to you and specifically states that any subsequent wills should be considered invalid unless they're signed in the presence of two specific witnesses. What if the judge doesn't believe it's real? The will was notarized by a licensed attorney and filed with the state registrar. It's more legitimate than anything Margaret can produce. But more importantly, the moment you present it, Margaret is going to react. She's going to say something, do something, that proves she knew about the forgery all along. Agent Chen stood up and walked to a file cabinet, from which she retrieved what looked like a small electronic device. This is a digital recorder with a range of about 50 feet. It's voice-activated and will capture everything that happens in that courtroom. We'll have agents positioned outside the building, and the moment we have enough evidence of perjury and fraud, we'll move in. I took the device, surprised by how light it was. What about afterward? If Margaret figures out what happened, if she realizes that I've been working with the FBI. After today, Margaret Chen is going to be in federal custody. Her entire network is going to be rolled up, based on the evidence your father provided. You won't have to worry about retaliation, because there won't be anyone left to retaliate. Agent Chen walked me through the plan 3 more times, making sure I understood every detail. I would arrive at the courthouse early, take a seat in the back of the courtroom, and wait for Margaret's legal team to present their case. I would listen to them lie about my father's intentions, about my character, about the legitimacy of their forged will. And then I would destroy them with the truth. Détourne fake. By the time I left the FBI office, the sun was high and hot, turning the Phoenix sky into a dome of blazing blue. I had 6 hours before my court appearance, 6 hours to prepare for the most important day of my life. I drove back to my apartment and showered, then stood in front of my closet trying to decide what one wears to a legal execution. I finally settled on a navy blue dress that I'd bought for job interviews, professional, serious, but not intimidating. I wanted to look like someone who deserved to inherit a legitimate business, not someone who was about to bring down a criminal empire. At noon, I called in sick to my job at the legal aid clinic. My supervisor, Maria, had been understanding when I'd explained that I had a family emergency involving my father's estate. "Good luck, Mija," she'd said. "Fight for what's yours." If only she knew what I was really fighting for. At 1 p.m., I sat in my car outside the courthouse, watching lawyers and clients stream through the marble columns that supported the building's imposing facade. Somewhere in that building, Margaret was probably meeting with her legal team, reviewing their strategy for eliminating me from my father's legacy once and for all. But she didn't know that Dad had left me one final gift. She didn't know that her perfect plan was about to collide with the truth she thought she'd buried along with my father. I checked the digital recorder one more time, making sure it was properly concealed, then walked toward the courthouse steps. In a few hours, I would either be vindicated or destroyed. There was no middle ground left. As I climbed those marble steps, I thought about Dad's letter, about his final words to me. Don't let her win. Don't let her destroy everything we built together. Margaret had stolen 3 years of my life. She'd murdered my father and corrupted his life's work. She'd tried to erase me from my own family's story. Today, I was going to erase her right back. The Maricopa County Superior Court building rose before me like a temple to justice, its limestone facade gleaming white-hot under the Arizona sun. At 2:45 p.m., 15 minutes before my scheduled appearance, I sat on a bench across the street, watching black sedans and luxury SUVs deposit Margaret's army of lawyers and witnesses at the courthouse steps. I recognized Margaret immediately, even from a distance. She wore a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, her black hair pulled back in that same architectural bun I remembered from our first meeting. She moved with the confident stride of someone who believed the game was already won, flanked by 3 men in identical navy suits who looked like they'd stepped out of a corporate recruiting brochure. My phone buzzed with a text from Agent Chen. 2 teams in position. Building is secured, you've got this. I touched the small recording device hidden beneath my jacket lapel, took a deep breath that tasted like desert dust and determination, and crossed the street. The courthouse lobby was a cathedral of marble and mahogany, its vaulted ceiling echoing with the whispered conversations of lawyers and their clients. I found courtroom 7B on the 3rd floor, a smaller chamber reserved for probate hearings and civil disputes. Nothing about the setting suggested that federal crimes were about to be exposed within its wood-paneled walls. I took a seat in the back row, close enough to hear everything but far enough away to avoid immediate attention. Margaret sat at the plaintiff's table with her legal team, occasionally turning to point at documents or whisper instructions. She hadn't noticed me yet, too focused on her performance as the grieving widow seeking closure. At exactly 3 p.m., the bailiff called the court to order. Judge Patricia Morrison entered wearing the standard black robes that somehow made her look both authoritative and approachable. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 50, with silver-streaked brown hair and the kind of sharp eyes that suggested she'd heard every lie the legal system had to offer. "This court is now in session," she announced, settling into her chair behind the bench. "We're here today for the matter of Rodriguez Estate Probate Petition 2024 PR00-847. Counsel, please state your appearances." Margaret's lead attorney stood up. A tall man with silver hair who looked like he charged by the syllable. "Your Honor, Richard Whitmore of Whitmore Associates, representing the petitioner, Mrs. Margaret Chen Rodriguez, widow of the deceased Miguel Rodriguez." "Very good. And for the respondent?" I stood up, my legs shakier than I'd expected. "Emma Rodriguez, Your Honor, daughter of the deceased, representing myself." Judge Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. "Ms. Rodriguez, are you certain you don't want legal representation for these proceedings? Estate disputes can be quite complex." "I'm certain, Your Honor. I believe the facts will speak for themselves." Margaret turned in her chair for the first time since I'd entered the courtroom. Our eyes met across the 30 feet of polished wood and marble that separated us, and I saw something flicker across her face: surprise, calculation, and what might have been the first hint of concern. "Very well," Judge Morrison said. "Mr. Whitmore, please proceed with your opening statement." Whitmore stood and buttoned his jacket with the practiced ease of someone who delivered 1,000 opening statements. He was good. I had to give him that. His voice was warm, but authoritative. Sympathetic, but not maudlin. "Your Honor, this is a tragic case of family dysfunction that has prevented the orderly settlement of a good man's estate. Miguel Rodriguez was a successful businessman who built Rodriguez Import/Export from nothing into a thriving enterprise. When he married my client 3 years ago, he gained not only a loving wife but a business partner who helped him modernize his operations and expand his market reach." I gritted my teeth as Whitmore painted a picture of Margaret as the devoted wife who'd transformed Dad's outdated business practices into a model of efficiency. Unfortunately, Mr. Rodriguez's relationship with his daughter had deteriorated significantly in the years before his death. Ms. Emma Rodriguez had been given every opportunity to participate in the family business, but she repeatedly rejected her father's attempts to include her. She chose instead to pursue her own path, making it clear that she had no interest in the import/export business or in maintaining family relationships. Whitmore gestured toward a stack of documents on his table. "The evidence will show that Mr. Rodriguez, though saddened by his daughter's choices, eventually accepted that she had effectively abandoned any claim to his legacy. His final will, executed just 6 months before his death, reflects this reality by leaving his entire estate to his wife, the woman who stood by him and supported his business during his final years. I watched Margaret nod sadly as Whitmore spoke, playing the role of the heartbroken stepmother who'd tried so hard to maintain family unity. If I hadn't known what I knew, I might have believed her performance myself. Your Honor, Whitmore continued, we ask this court to honor Mr. Rodriguez's clearly expressed wishes and approve the distribution of his estate according to the terms of his legally executed will. Mrs. Chen Rodriguez seeks only to fulfill her late husband's intentions and to continue operating the business he loved according to the principles he established. Judge Morrison made notes as Whitmore spoke, occasionally glancing in my direction. When he finished, she turned to me. Ms. Rodriguez, do you wish to make an opening statement? I stood, feeling the weight of the recording device against my chest, and the even heavier weight of everything I knew about Margaret's crimes. Yes, Your Honor. I believe there are facts about my father's death and my stepmother's actions that this court needs to hear before making any decisions about his estate. Margaret's lawyer immediately objected. Your Honor, this is a probate hearing, not a criminal proceeding. The circumstances of Mr. Rodriguez's death are not relevant to the question of estate distribution. Your Honor, I said, I believe they're extremely relevant. If the court will allow me to present evidence, I think the connection will become clear. Judge Morrison studied me for a long moment. Ms. Rodriguez, I'll give you some latitude, but please keep your statements focused on matters directly related to the probate petition. Thank you, Your Honor. I took a breath and looked directly at Margaret. Her perfect composure had developed the tiniest crack. Your Honor, my father didn't die of natural causes. He was murdered by the woman who now claims to be his loving widow. And the business she's asking this court to give her legal control of has been used for the past 3 years to commit federal crimes including money laundering, document fraud, and human trafficking. The courtroom erupted. Whitmore was on his feet shouting objections, Margaret had gone pale, and Judge Morrison was banging her gavel for order. Ms. Eberau never bid. Rodriguez, the judge said when the chaos subsided. Those are extremely serious allegations. Do you have evidence to support them? I do, Your Honor. I reached into my bag and pulled out Dad's manila envelope, thick with documents and recordings. But instead of approaching the bench, I remained standing at my seat. However, before I present that evidence, I'd like to hear what my stepmother has to say under oath about her relationship with my father and her management of his business. Judge Morrison looked confused. Ms. Rodriguez, that's not how probate proceedings typically work. The petitioner presents their case, you present yours, and then... Your Honor, I'm asking for the opportunity to question the petitioner about statements made in her probate filing. Specifically, her claims about my father's mental state and his reasons for allegedly excluding me from his will. Whitmore was back on his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Ms. Rodriguez is not an attorney and cannot conduct cross-examination of our client. Your Honor, I said, I'm not asking to cross-examine. I'm asking for the opportunity to present evidence that directly contradicts statements made in the probate petition. But I think it would be helpful for the court to hear Mrs. Chen Rodriguez explain those statements first. Judge Morrison was clearly outside her normal comfort zone, but she was also curious. I could see it in her eyes. Mrs. Chen Rodriguez, are you willing to answer questions about statements in your probate filing? Margaret stood slowly. Even from across the courtroom, I could see that her hands were trembling slightly. But her voice was steady when she spoke. Of course, Your Honor. I have nothing to hide. Very well. Mrs. Chen Rodriguez, please approach the witness stand. The next 20 minutes were a masterclass in calculated deception. Margaret, under oath, painted a picture of a devoted wife who'd tried desperately to reconcile a stubborn father with his ungrateful daughter. She spoke about my emotional instability, my rejection of family values, and my abandonment of both my father and his business. Miguel was heartbroken, she testified, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. He'd built that business hoping to pass it on to Emma, but she made it clear that she wanted nothing to do with it. She rarely called, never visited, and when she did interact with us, it was usually to criticize our business decisions or demand money. I listened to her lies with growing amazement. She'd thought of everything. created a narrative that explained my absence, justified my exclusion, and painted herself as the loyal wife who'd tried to save a broken family. When Judge Morrison asked about the business operations, Margaret's performance became even more polished. Miguel was old-fashioned in many ways, she said. He relied on handshake deals and personal relationships that, while admirable, weren't always profitable or sustainable. I helped him modernize, implement proper accounting systems, establish more reliable supplier relationships, streamline operations. The business is more successful now than it's ever been. And regarding Mr. Rodriguez's will, Judge Morrison asked, can you explain the circumstances under which it was executed? Miguel had been concerned about estate planning for months, Margaret replied. He'd seen what happened to other business owners who died without proper arrangements. Families torn apart by legal disputes, businesses destroyed by probate delays. He asked me to help him find an attorney who could create a will that would ensure business continuity. She gestured toward the documents on Whitmore's table. The will was executed in the presence of 2 witnesses and properly notarized. Miguel was of sound mind and specifically stated that he wanted the business to go to someone who would preserve what he'd built. Unfortunately, that someone wasn't his daughter. When Margaret finished her testimony, Judge Morrison turned to me. Ms. Rodriguez, do you have questions for the witness? I stood, feeling the recording device capture every word. Just a few, Your Honor. I looked directly at Margaret, who met my gaze with that same perfect smile she'd worn at every family dinner where she'd slowly erased me from my father's life. Mrs. Chen Rodriguez, you testified that my father was of sound mind when he executed his will 6 months before his death. Is that correct? Yes. And you testified that he wanted the business to go to someone who would preserve what he'd built? That's correct. Did my father ever express concerns to you about the legitimacy of the business operations under your management? Whitmore started to object, but Margaret answered before he could speak. No, Miguel was very pleased with the improvements we'd made. Did he ever question you about discrepancies between shipping manifests and actual cargo weights? This time, Margaret hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. I don't know what you mean. Did my father ever accuse you of using Rodriguez import/export to launder money for criminal organizations? Objection! Whitmore was on his feet. Your Honor, this is completely inappropriate. These questions have no bearing on the probate matter before this court. But Judge Morrison was leaning forward, clearly intrigued. I'll allow the question. Mrs. Chen Rodriguez, please answer. Margaret's composure was cracking. No, your father never made any such accusation because there was no basis for one. Mrs. Chen Rodriguez, are you familiar with the effects of digitalis on the human heart? The color drained from Margaret's face. What? Digitalis. It's a heart medication. In proper doses, it regulates heart rhythm. In improper doses, it can cause cardiac arrest. Are you familiar with it? Your Honor, Whitmore said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. I demand to know the relevance of this line of questioning. Ms. Rodriguez, Judge Morrison said, please explain the connection. I reached into Dad's envelope and pulled out a small digital recorder. Your Honor, my father suspected that his wife was poisoning him with digitalis. He also suspected that she was using his business to commit federal crimes. So he documented everything. I held up the recorder. This device contains 28 separate recordings made by Miguel Rodriguez between January and April of this year. In these recordings, my father documents his wife's criminal activities and her plans to murder him. The courtroom exploded again. Margaret was on her feet, her face contorted with rage and terror. That's impossible, she screamed. Miguel he couldn't have. Mrs. Chen Rodriguez, Judge Morrison said sharply, please sit down and remain quiet. But Margaret was beyond listening. She turned to face me, her mask finally dropping completely. You stupid little bitch, you have no idea what you're dealing with. That business belongs to me. I built it into something that matters, something that makes real money. Your father was a pathetic old man who would have run it into the ground. Mrs. Chen Rodriguez. Judge Morrison's voice cut through Margaret's rant like a blade. You will sit down immediately, or I will hold you in contempt." Margaret seemed to realize what she'd done. She looked around the courtroom at the shocked faces, at the court reporter whose fingers were flying over her keyboard, at Whitmore who was staring at her like she'd just confessed to murder, which, essentially, she had. I reached into the envelope again and pulled out a thick stack of documents. "Your Honor, I also have financial records showing that Mrs. Chen Rodriguez used my father's business to launder more than $3 million over the past 2 years. I have shipping manifests that prove she was smuggling illegal goods and possibly people through Rodriguez import/export. And I have recordings of her threatening to kill my father if he interfered with her operations." Judge Morrison was writing furiously. "Ms. Rodriguez, these are allegations of federal crimes. Have you reported this evidence to appropriate law enforcement?" "Yes, Your Honor. FBI agent Sarah Chen has been investigating Mrs. Chen Rodriguez's network for 18 months. She's standing by to take custody of the defendant and all evidence related to these crimes." I pulled out my phone and sent a single text. "Now." Within 30 seconds, the courtroom doors burst open. Agent Chen strode in, followed by 6 federal agents in tactical gear. Margaret tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The agents surrounded her table before she could take 3 steps. "Margaret Chen," Agent Chen announced, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned courtroom. "You're under arrest for money laundering, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit human trafficking, and murder in the first degree." As the agents handcuffed Margaret, she looked back at me with pure hatred. "You think you've won?" she snarled. "You have no idea how deep this goes. You have no idea who you're dealing with. They'll come for you, Emma. They'll come for you and—" One of the agents put his hand over her mouth and dragged her toward the exit. The last I saw of Margaret Chen was her perfectly styled hair disappearing through the courtroom doors. Judge Morrison sat in stunned silence for a full minute. When she finally spoke, her voice was careful and measured. "Ms. Rodriguez, I'm going to suspend these proceedings pending the outcome of the federal investigation. However, I want to address one more matter before we adjourn." She gestured to the documents still scattered across Margaret's abandoned table. "You mentioned that you believe Mrs. Chen Rodriguez forged your father's will. Do you have evidence to support that claim?" I reached into Dad's envelope one final time and pulled out a document I'd been saving for this moment. "Your Honor, this is my father's real will, executed 2 months before his marriage to Margaret Chen. It was filed with the state registrar and notarized by attorney James Morrison of Morrison and Associates." Judge Morrison's eyebrows shot up. "James Morrison is my father. He retired from practice 5 years ago." "Yes, Your Honor. My father chose him specifically because he had a reputation for absolute integrity and meticulous record-keeping. This will leaves the entire Rodriguez estate to me, with specific provisions that any subsequent wills should be considered invalid unless signed in the presence of 2 particular witnesses." I handed the document to the bailiff, who passed it to Judge Morrison. "The 2 witnesses specified in the will," I continued, "are my father's brother Carlos Rodriguez and his longtime friend, Father Miguel Santos. Neither of them was present when Margaret's alleged will was signed, and neither of them has any memory of my father expressing any intention to exclude me from his inheritance." Judge Morrison studied the will carefully, comparing it to the documents Margaret's lawyers had submitted. "Ms. Rodriguez, this will appears to be properly executed and legally valid. The document submitted by Mrs. Chen Rodriguez's attorneys appears to be problematic." She looked up at Whitmore, who was still standing at his table looking like he'd been hit by a truck. "Mr. Whitmore, did you or your firm conduct any independent verification of the will presented on behalf of your client?" Whitmore's voice was barely above a whisper. We relied on Mrs. Chen Rodriguez's representation that the document was legitimate. We had no reason to doubt." "I see. Well, Mr. Whitmore, I suggest you and your firm conduct a thorough review of your client intake procedures. This court will not tolerate the presentation of fraudulent documents, regardless of whether counsel was aware of their illegitimate nature." Judge Morrison turned back to me. "Ms. Rodriguez, based on the evidence presented today, I'm prepared to issue a preliminary ruling recognizing your inheritance rights under your father's legitimate will. However, given the ongoing federal investigation, I'm going to place the business assets in temporary receivership until all criminal matters are resolved." She banged her gavel once. "Court is adjourned pending further proceedings." As the courtroom emptied, I remained in my seat, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just happened. 3 years of exile, 3 years of struggle and doubt and grief had just been vindicated in a single afternoon. "Mom Fours," Agent Chen approached me as I gathered Dad's documents. "How do you feel?" she asked. I thought about the question. How did I feel? Relieved, certainly. Vindicated, absolutely. But also strangely empty. As if the anger and determination that had sustained me for so long had suddenly evaporated, leaving me uncertain of what came next. "I feel like my father can finally rest in peace," I said. Agent Chen nodded. "The federal prosecutor will need you to testify when Margaret's case goes to trial. Are you prepared for that?" "Yes. But what happens to the business in the meantime?" "The court-appointed receiver will manage operations while we complete our investigation. Any legitimate contracts and relationships will be preserved, but we'll need to audit every transaction from the past 3 years to determine what was legal and what wasn't." I thought about the artisan families my father had worked with for decades, the relationships Margaret had severed in favor of her criminal contacts. "Agent Chen, what are the chances that we can restore the business to what it used to be? Can we go back to working with the traditional suppliers, the families my father cared about?" She smiled. "Emma, that business is going to be yours, free and clear within 6 months. What you do with it after that is entirely up to you." As I walked out of the courthouse, the late afternoon sun was painting the Phoenix sky in shades of orange and gold. For the first time in 3 years, I had a future that extended beyond just surviving from one month to the next. So I had a legacy to rebuild and a father's memory to honor. But first, I was going to find the Morales family and tell them that Rodriguez Import/Export was back in business. 6 months later, I stood in the same warehouse where my father had taught me to read invoices and dream about building bridges between cultures. The space smelled like coffee beans and vanilla again, like cardamom and tradition. The criminal machinery Margaret had installed was gone, replaced by the organized chaos of a family business that valued relationships over profit margins. Margaret Chen was serving a 25-year sentence in federal prison after pleading guilty to 17 felony counts. Her criminal network had been dismantled, with more than 40 people arrested across 6 states. The money she'd laundered through my father's business had been recovered and returned to its victims, including several families who'd been trafficked through the operation she'd built. Whitmore Associates had been sanctioned by the Arizona Bar Association for failing to verify the authenticity of documents presented to the court. Richard Whitmore himself had retired rather than face additional disciplinary proceedings. And I had learned something my father had tried to teach me long ago, that some victories are worth waiting for, and some truths are worth fighting for, no matter how long it takes. The envelope he'd left me hadn't just contained evidence of crimes. It had contained proof that even when everything seems lost, even when the people we trust most betray us, the truth has a way of surviving. Margaret had tried to erase me from my father's story. Instead, she'd given me the chance to write a new chapter, one where justice prevailed and family meant more than money. Standing in that warehouse, surrounded by the scents and sounds of honest work, I could almost hear my father's voice. "Someday, Mija, this will all be yours. You'll carry on what we built together." Someday had finally arrived. The FBI had stormed in, just as I'd promised in that courtroom. But the real victory wasn't in Margaret's arrest, or in reclaiming my inheritance. The real victory was in proving that my father's faith in me had been justified all along. Some stories end with revenge. This one ended with redemption. Haskekli Sayariko Avevaso. And it was just the beginning.